Midnight Shutdown Chapter 1. 12 hours until midnight. Cipher grinned at his screen, fingers tapping in a relentless rhythm, code lines blurred on his monitors, a dark symphony of symbols. Each line, a tiny act of rebellion, fueled his plan. Tonight, the city would go dark. Behind him, Mara watched with a mix of awe and fear. She was new to this level of chaos, just 2 years in, and yet Cipher already trusted her like no one else. She'd never seen anyone work like him, precise, almost predatory in his confidence. But tonight, she felt a flicker of doubt. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. The soft hum of machines swallowed her voice, but Cipher caught it. He always did. "Mara," he said with a sharp, almost amused look, "they need this. They think they're invincible. We're going to remind them how fragile they are." She swallowed, nodding. She believed in him. She'd seen him dismantle systems that people called untouchable. Still, something about tonight's plan gnawed at her. He didn't see the people, the ordinary lives he'd disrupt. For Cipher, they were collateral, part of a necessary lesson. Cipher's gaze returned to the monitors. The city grid blinked back at him, vulnerable, oblivious. Midnight, his moment. And when it struck, they would all remember his name. Chapter 2. Nick Lawson. 11 hours until midnight. Nick Lawson woke with a start, his phone buzzing insistently against his desk. He blinked, squinting against the glare of the desk lamp, the half-empty whiskey bottle next to him casting a long shadow over his cluttered office. Jess Ramirez. Her name flashed on the screen, and his stomach tightened. She didn't call without a reason. They hadn't worked together since he left the force, but she was one of the few people who still kept in touch, one of the few who believed he could still be the investigator he once was. He tapped play on her voicemail, her voice snapping him out of his grogginess. "Nick, it's Jess. I think you need to see this." Her tone was sharp, urgent, the kind of tone she used when there was no time to waste. Nick shrugged on his jacket, grabbing his keys as he headed out the door. Rain pattered on the windshield as he started the engine, the city's glow blurred by the wet glass. Midway there, his phone buzzed with a text. Another message from Jess. Dark web chatter. Cyber attack on the grid tonight. Big players involved. His grip on the wheel tightened. The rumors about a new cyber mastermind lurking in the city's shadows had been circulating for weeks, but it was the kind of thing he'd tried to tune out. That world, the one he used to chase so relentlessly, felt miles away. But something about Jess's message, the urgency behind it, tugged at him. Just one more time, he thought, feeling that familiar itch, that dark thrill of the hunt. Chapter 3. The Stakes. 10 hours until midnight. Jess Ramirez hunched over her laptop, scrolling through line after line of code. The numbers and symbols blurred together, but she couldn't afford to stop. Chatter on the dark web pointed to something big, a potential citywide blackout. But every trace she found seemed to slip away, like the culprit was taunting her. Her phone buzzed, and she didn't need to look to know who it was. Nick. She sighed, feeling the weight of another case tugging at the back of her mind. A young journalist named Lila Moreno had vanished the previous week. Last seen digging into a city corruption scandal, her leads cut a little too close to home, and now she disappeared without a trace. "Jess!" Nick's voice brought her back to the moment. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his gaze taking in the mess of open files on her screen. "What's the emergency?" he asked, closing the door behind him. She pointed to her screen. "Someone's going after the grid tonight. The chatter is everywhere. Midnight, the city goes dark." She scrolled to a name she'd found buried in the messages. Cipher. Nick's face darkened. Cipher? Thought he was just a ghost story. "So did I, but he's real, and he's not messing around." She gestured to the countdown timer on her screen, each second ticking away with ruthless precision. Chapter 4. The Missing Journalist. 9 hours until midnight. As Jess worked with Nick, her mind kept drifting to Leela's case. The young journalist was ambitious, relentless, too new to know when to stop pushing. She'd been digging into corruption at City Hall, hinting at connections to organized crime. Jess had followed the trail as far as she could, but Leela's bosses had told her to back off, assuming the journalist had gotten in over her head. Jess didn't buy it. The last notes Lila had left behind mentioned a councilman, Martin Decker, with ties to mob figures. Jess sensed the stories weren't isolated. Cipher's motives, Lila's investigation, they were connected somehow, pieces of a much bigger puzzle. "Hey," Nick's voice broke her train of thought. He was watching her, brow furrowed. "You okay?" She nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Just thinking about something else, a missing person." "Yeah? Doesn't sound like your usual," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Lila Moreno," she replied, "journalist. She was digging into the councilman, Decker, shady real estate deals, mob connections." She sighed. "She disappeared last week. No leads, nothing." Nick's expression hardened. "And you think it's connected?" Jess hesitated. "I don't know, but Cipher's targets and Lila's investigation, it feels like there's something tying them together." They shared a look, both aware of the unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't just another case, and they both knew it. Chapter 5. Cipher's Network. 8 hours until midnight. In the darkened room, Cipher leaned back, watching his screen as the city's lights pulsed. On his monitors, each sector of the grid glowed, waiting for his command to go dark. Every streetlight, every emergency system, they were all his to control. This was his masterpiece. Mara typed anxiously across the room, trying to look focused while stealing glances at Cipher. Her loyalty was absolute, but tonight she couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in her chest. "Do you think it'll really work?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cipher turned to her, smirking. "Mara, this is everything we've worked for. People like them. They think they're safe, untouchable. Tonight, they'll know they're wrong." She nodded, but unease flickered across her face. Cipher turned back to his screen, catching an article by Lila Moreno. He chuckled to himself. Lila was just another pawn, just like Mara, a piece of his plan to dismantle the system. Who was she, again? Cipher mused, knowing Mara could hear him. Who? Mara asked, looking up. Lila Moreno, journalist. She had a lot to say about corruption, Cipher said, a smirk tugging at his lips. People like her think they can change things with words. Mara hesitated, hearing the quiet menace in his tone. She'd admired Lila's work, respected her courage, and seeing Cipher's disdain only deepened her doubts. Chapter 6. Mara and Nate, 6 hours until midnight. The first blackout hit in the heart of downtown. A test, just a flicker. Traffic halted, streetlights blinked out, and for a moment, chaos reigned. Cipher watched his screens as reports rolled in, each one confirming his control. Across the room, Mara's mind was far from the screens. She glanced at Nate, who was tense, his fingers tapping nervously on his keyboard. Nate was younger, eager, his idealism intact in a way that hers hadn't been in years. They'd worked closely on several missions, and she couldn't deny how much she cared about him, even if she tried to hide it. Flashback. Mara and Nate's bond. Months earlier, Mara and Nate had spent countless hours hacking into encrypted files, piecing together fragments of city secrets. One night, Nate had pulled up a movie, trying to lighten the mood. They sat together, watching, and for a moment, Mara forgot about the mission, the darkness around them. She remembered laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like years. "Cipher's lucky to have you," Nate had said softly, his eyes holding hers. "You're different, better than all this." Mara's heart twisted, but she'd looked away, unwilling to acknowledge what his words stirred in her. She'd convinced herself that emotions were a distraction, a weakness. But here, tonight, she felt those walls cracking. Chapter 7. Nate's Doubts. 5 hours until midnight. Nate felt the tension in the room, saw the fear in Mara's eyes, and it only intensified his own doubts. He'd idolized Cipher once, convinced that his mission was a noble one, a necessary act of rebellion. But as he watched the city blink in and out, fear and chaos spreading with each flicker, he felt something shift. Mara caught him watching her, worry etched across his face. "Are you okay?" she whispered, the question barely audible. Nate hesitated, glancing at Cipher across the room. "Mara, maybe this isn't right." She didn't respond immediately, and Nate saw the conflict in her eyes. He realized then that his feelings for her went deeper than admiration. She wasn't just his partner. She was the one thing grounding him in this madness. Cipher's voice cut through the silence, and Nate flinched. Cipher had noticed the tension, and his gaze was hard. "Stay focused, Nate," Cipher said coolly. "This isn't about second-guessing. It's about seeing it through." Nate nodded, swallowing hard. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Cipher was watching, his cold eyes noting every doubt, every hesitation. Chapter 8. The Investigation. 4 hours until midnight. Back at the precinct, Nick and Jess sat at a cramped desk, papers and files scattered between them. The air was thick with tension. Jess's fingers tapped restlessly on her phone, pulling up details on Leila Moreno's last few movements, her search now interwoven with their hunt for Cipher. Leila wasn't just any journalist, Jess said, scanning an old article on her phone. She was digging into serious stuff, illegal land acquisitions, backdoor deals at City Hall. She was after something dangerous, and I think that's why she vanished. Nick leaned back, studying Jess with narrowed eyes. "You think Cipher got to her?" Jess shrugged, clearly torn. "Not directly. I don't think he cares about her. But someone else might. Maybe she knew too much about the same people Cipher wants to expose." Nick rubbed his chin, lost in thought. Cipher's plan seemed to stretch wider with every clue they uncovered, his grip extending into places they hadn't expected. And if Lila's investigation had rattled the wrong people, she might have uncovered something Cipher could use. "You think she left something behind?" he asked, trying to follow Jess's train of thought. Jess nodded, her gaze intense. "A USB drive, her notes, something. If we can find whatever Lila was working on, we might figure out what Cipher's targeting, and maybe why." Nick exhaled. They needed a break, a lead, anything. Because if they couldn't crack this puzzle in time, the city would be Cipher's playground come midnight. Chapter 9. The Confession, 3 hours until midnight. Back at the power station, Cipher stood by Mara's workstation, watching her monitor. She felt his presence, a shadow hovering behind her, and forced herself to focus, her hands steady on the keyboard. But her heart raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew, about Nate, about her doubts. "Everything ready?" Cipher asked, his voice calm, almost pleasant. Mara swallowed, nodding. "Yes, we're on track for midnight." Cipher's hand rested on her shoulder for a second too long, and Mara felt a chill run through her. He didn't say anything, but his silence was a warning. He knew something was off. Later, as Cipher drifted away, Nate caught Mara's eye from across the room, his expression worried. He motioned her over, and she slipped out, finding him in a quiet corner of the station. "Mara, we need to leave," Nate whispered, his voice tense. "This isn't right. Cipher's taking things too far. This blackout, people could get hurt." Mara's throat tightened. She felt the same dread, the same fear, but leaving Cipher? It was almost unthinkable. He had found her when she was lost, given her purpose. But now she felt like she was spiraling into something she couldn't control. Nate's eyes searched hers, filled with desperation. "We can get out, Mara. There's a way out." She wanted to believe him, to let herself imagine a life outside Cipher's shadow. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Cipher wouldn't just let them walk away. I don't know," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt her heart ache at Nate's hopeful gaze, but fear held her back. They couldn't afford a mistake, but Nate reached out, grabbing her hand. "If you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for us. I can't stay here without you." The words hung between them, unspoken until now, charged with all the longing and hope they'd kept hidden. But just as Mara felt herself give in, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Is there a problem?" They froze. Cipher stepped into view, his gaze cold and assessing. Mara's stomach dropped. He'd heard everything. Chapter 10. Cipher's Wrath. 2 hours until midnight. Cipher stared at them, his face unreadable. But Mara could feel the fury simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He was a man who thrived on control, and their betrayal cut deep. "I thought you both understood the importance of tonight," he said softly, dangerously. "But maybe I was wrong." Nate took a step forward, shielding Mara. "Cipher, we didn't mean." Cipher raised a hand, silencing him. "Loyalty, Nate. Do you even understand what that means?" Nate swallowed, his face paling. I do, but people don't have to get hurt. This plan, it's too much." Cipher's expression twisted, a cruel smile breaking through. "Too much? I've seen people like you who think they can pick and choose their loyalty. but loyalty isn't negotiable. He turned his gaze to Mara, his eyes hard. And you, Mara, after everything I've given you? Mara's pulse raced. She'd followed Cipher without question for so long, but tonight she could barely meet his gaze. Nate's words lingered in her mind, tugging at her doubts, her hope. She wanted to be free of this, of Cipher's control. Cipher's gaze darkened, and he moved closer, his voice low. Tonight, we show this city what power really looks like, and if either of you betray me again, I won't hesitate to remind you what happens to traitors. He turned, leaving them both standing in the cold shadows, the weight of his threat pressing down on them. Mara felt her heart sink. They were trapped, prisoners of Cipher's wrath and their own desperation. Chapter 11. Nick's Revelation. 1 hour until midnight. Nick and Jess huddled over Jess's laptop, piecing together the last fragments of Lila's case. Jess had found something in Lila's encrypted files, something that hinted at a conspiracy in the city's highest ranks. Councilman Decker, the mob, even the city's infrastructure contracts, it all tied back to the corruption Lila had been investigating. "Look at this," Jess said, her eyes wide. She pulled up a document on her screen, a contract signed by Decker that detailed plans for a massive real estate project. But the project had never happened. Funds had disappeared, redirected, and the contracts led nowhere. Nick felt his pulse quicken. It's money laundering. They're using city projects to funnel money into private accounts. Jess nodded, her voice tight. And Lila was onto it. She found the proof, and that's why she disappeared. Nick leaned closer, his mind racing. If Cipher got his hands on this, he could blow the whole operation wide open. But he doesn't care about justice. He'll destroy everything just to prove his point. A sense of urgency settled over them. They were running out of time, and if they couldn't stop Cipher by midnight, the city would pay the price for his vendetta. Chapter 12. Mara's Decision. 30 minutes until midnight. Mara sat at her workstation, hands shaking as she watched the countdown on her monitor. Nate's words echoed in her mind, tugging at her last shreds of doubt. Cipher's plan would bring the city to its knees, but at what cost? She glanced over at Nate, who was watching her with a desperate look. He hadn't said anything since Cipher's threat, but she could see the fear and resolve in his eyes. Mara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. She could stay, follow Cipher's orders, or she could take a risk, defy him, and help Nate escape. She felt her heart race as she leaned over to Nate, her voice barely a whisper. "We're leaving, now." Nate's eyes widened, a flash of hope breaking through his fear. They moved quickly, slipping through the dark corridors of the power station, navigating their way toward an exit. But just as they neared the door, Cipher's voice rang out. "Leaving so soon?" They turned, their hearts pounding, as Cipher emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with fury. He stepped closer, his gaze cold and calculating. "You really thought you could betray me?" he sneered, his voice laced with venom. "After everything I've done for you?" Mara felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, refusing to let him control her any longer. "This isn't about loyalty, Cipher. This is madness. You're hurting innocent people." Cipher's gaze hardened, and he took another step toward them. "Then consider this your punishment." Before they could react, Cipher raised a small remote in his hand, his thumb hovering over a button. Mara's heart dropped as she realized what he was about to do. But Nate moved first. With a desperate look at Mara, he lunged at Cipher, grabbing the remote and shoving her toward the exit. "Go, Mara," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Get out!" Mara stumbled, her heart racing as she watched Cipher and Nate struggle. She wanted to run back, to help, but she knew Nate had made his choice. With one last look, she turned and ran, the sound of their fight echoing behind her as she disappeared into the night. Chapter 13. Showdown. 10 minutes until midnight. Nick and Jess sped toward the power station, the city's darkened streets stretching out before them. The silence felt ominous, a calm before the storm, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Nick's phone buzzed with a message, a final taunt from Cipher. 10 minutes, Nick. Tick-tock. They pulled up to the power station, and Nick's heart pounded as they climbed out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, they found Mara, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. She stumbled toward them, her voice trembling. "Cipher, he's still in there. He's going to bring down the city." Nick felt a surge of adrenaline, his mind racing. They were so close, but if they couldn't stop Cipher in time, it would all be over. He nodded to Jess, their silent resolve shared as they plunged into the darkness of the station, ready to face Cipher one last time. Chapter 14. Into the Darkness. 5 minutes until midnight. Nick and Jess moved through the darkened corridors of the power station, their flashlights cutting thin beams of light through the dusty air. The building felt eerily quiet, every step amplified in the silence, but the air was charged with tension. Nick's pulse quickened. This was it, the final stretch. Beside him, Jess scanned the area, her face set in fierce determination. She'd seen the devastation Cipher was capable of, both from tonight's events and the many cases that had led them here. And now, after everything, it was down to her and Nick. The corridor split, leading to 2 separate areas. Jess nodded toward one direction. "I'll check this way. Meet back here in 2 minutes." Nick hesitated, but he trusted Jess. They didn't have time to waste. He nodded and slipped down the other corridor, feeling the weight of every second ticking by. Midnight was approaching fast, and Cipher was counting on their hesitation, their fear. But Nick wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Chapter 15. Cipher's Control Room. Cipher stood in the control room, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, the timer ticking down on the screen beside him. He could feel the weight of his plan in each remaining second, a plan that would reshape the city, send a message that couldn't be ignored. But he was distracted, his thoughts circling back to Mara and Nate. They'd shown weakness, a kind of disloyalty that infuriated him. Nate's last act of defiance had been galling, a reminder of the frailties Cipher despised. Love, loyalty to another person. That's how people are controlled, Cipher thought bitterly. He tightened his grip on the remote in his hand. Nate had taken his stand, but Cipher wasn't finished. There were still layers to his plan, backup systems that only he could access, and he was about to set them in motion. The faint echo of footsteps made him look up. He allowed himself a smirk, knowing who was coming. After all, this was a game, one he'd prepared for. A shadow appeared at the doorway. Nick stepped in, his face hard, eyes scanning the room before they settled on Cipher. "It's over," Nick said, his voice low, calm. But there was an edge to it, a promise. Cipher laughed softly. "Over? No, Nick, it's just beginning." He raised the remote, his thumb pressing against the button. Nick's eyes widened, realizing Cipher's intent. "Stop!" Nick shouted, lunging forward. But Cipher moved quickly, his thumb pressing the button, sending a final command through the system. Chapter 16. The countdown 30 seconds until midnight. Jess sprinted down the corridor, hearing Nick's shout echo through the walls. She quickened her pace, her mind racing as she put together what might be happening. She reached the control room just as Nick tackled Cipher, knocking the remote from his hand. It skidded across the floor, stopping at her feet. Cipher scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with fury as he turned to Jess, recognizing her. "You just keep showing up, don't you?" Jess held the remote tightly, her eyes narrowing. "Turn it off, Cipher. This doesn't have to end like this." Cipher laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. "You think you can stop me? You think any of this matters?" He gestured around the room, the timer flashing on the screen behind him. "This whole city is rotten. I'm just giving it a reason to remember what power looks like." Nick stepped between Jess and Cipher, his fists clenched. "This isn't power, it's destruction." Cipher smirked, his gaze icy. "Sometimes you have to tear it all down to build something new. Isn't that what you taught me?" The words hung in the air, a dark echo from their shared past. Nick felt a chill, remembering Lucas Grant, the man he once trusted, the man he'd exposed. And now, standing here as Cipher, Lucas had become everything Nick had tried to prevent. But there was no time left to debate. The timer on the screen hit. Jess's gaze flicked to the screen, then back to Nick. "Whatever we do, we have to do it now." Chapter 17. Nate's Sacrifice. Mara stumbled out of the power station, breathing hard, her body trembling. She kept running, glancing back only once to see the outline of the building fading into the darkness. Nate's face flashed through her mind, his last words echoing in her ears. "Get out, Mara! Go!" She'd wanted to stay, to fight with him, but he'd made her promise. She could still feel the weight of his hand on her shoulder, his fierce determination as he'd faced Cipher. She choked back a sob, pushing herself forward. She couldn't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Somewhere behind her, a faint rumble reverberated through the night as the city plunged into darkness. Her heart sank, realizing Cipher had succeeded, at least partially. But she knew Nick and Jess were still inside, and a spark of hope flickered. She couldn't help them now, but she could make sure that whatever Cipher had planned, it wouldn't end here. She made her way to an empty alley, retrieving a burner phone from her pocket. With a steady hand, she dialed the emergency line, her voice breaking as she spoke. "There's been a cyber attack on the power grid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The culprit is... he's in the power station. Please, send help." She hung up, her hands shaking. It wasn't much, but it was all she could do. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Nate's face flashed through her mind again, and she whispered, "This is for you." Chapter 18, The Final Confrontation. The room plunged into darkness. Cipher's smirk faded as the screens went black, the sound of silence filling the space. Nick and Jess exchanged a look, realizing they were out of time. Cipher's smirk reappeared in the faint glow of a single backup light. "It's done. The city's mine." But Nick wasn't finished. He lunged at Cipher, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Cipher's laughter turned to a choked cough as he tried to pull free. "Look at you, Nick," Cipher gasped, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still trying to play the hero, but you're just as flawed as the rest of them." Nick's grip tightened. "Maybe, but I don't destroy lives for a twisted sense of justice." With a swift motion, Jess swept up the remote, examining it closely. She glanced at Nick, her expression grim. "It's not over yet. There's still a chance we can reverse this if we can get back into the system." Cipher laughed weakly. "You'll never figure it out. It's encrypted. Only I can unlock it." Jess shot him a look, her eyes narrowing. "Then you're coming with us." Cipher's smirk wavered, but he knew he was cornered. With the city already in darkness, there was nowhere left to run. Nick kept a firm hold on him as they made their way toward the main system room, determined to undo Cipher's work. Chapter 19, Reversing the Blackout. Inside the system room, Jess began working furiously at the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she navigated the complex coding Cipher had put in place. Nick stood behind her, watching Cipher closely, ready for any trick. "Is it possible?" Nick asked, his voice tense. Jess bit her lip, focused. "He encrypted everything. But I think I can override it. It'll take a minute." Cipher smirked from where Nick held him, his tone mocking. "You're too late. The city's already in chaos. People will panic. They'll turn on each other." Jess ignored him, her fingers steady, her gaze intense. Cipher's words were like poison, seeping into the room, but she wouldn't let him shake her. She'd come too far for that. The screen flickered, and a progress bar appeared. 25%, 40%, 60%. They were close, but Cipher's gaze darkened, a last-ditch attempt brewing behind his cold eyes. With a sudden burst of energy, Cipher wrenched himself free from Nick's grip, lunging toward Jess. Nick reacted instinctively, grabbing Cipher and pulling him back, but not before Cipher managed to slam a fist against the keyboard, interrupting the progress. The screen went blank. The progress bar stalled at 75%. "No!" Jess cried, frantically trying to reboot the system. Cipher sneered. "You'll never win. The city belongs to me now." But Jess wasn't giving up. She glanced at Nick, determination burning in her eyes. "Hold him. I can finish this." Nick's grip tightened on Cipher, his voice low, dangerous. "You'll pay for what you've done." Cipher's smirk faded, realizing Nick meant every word. He struggled, but Nick's grip was ironclad, his rage barely contained. Jess's fingers flew over the keys, and the screen flickered back to life. The progress bar resumed, inching forward, 80%, 90%, 100%. The power station hummed to life as the grid reactivated, and lights began flickering on across the city. Jess let out a breath, a a triumphant smile breaking across her face. Cipher's face twisted in rage as he realized his plan had failed. The city was coming back online, his control slipping away. "You may have won tonight," he spat, "but this isn't over." Nick stepped forward, his gaze cold. "It is for you." Chapter 20, Resolution 1 a.m. As dawn began to break over the city, Nick and Jess watched from a distance as police swarmed the power station, securing Cipher once and for all. The city's power had been restored, the threat neutralized, but the cost weighed heavily on them both. Nick took a deep breath, the weight of the night settling over him. "We did it," he murmured, but his tone was subdued, haunted. Jess glanced at him, understanding the unspoken pain. "We saved the city. That's what matters." Nick nodded, but his thoughts drifted to the people affected, the lives that had been disrupted, the damage Cipher had caused in his twisted mission. And then there was Mara, a mystery left unresolved. He could only hope she'd find a way out, a new beginning away from Cipher's shadow. Jess squeezed his shoulder. "Come on, let's get some rest." They walked away from the scene, knowing that while the city was safe for now, the battle against corruption and chaos would always be there, lurking in the shadows. And somewhere in the city, Mara watched from a rooftop, a silent promise to herself echoing in her mind. For Nate. For the city.